Good morning. My name is Tim Clarkin, and I am a hydrologic engineer with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. A lot of my work has to do with flood hazard analyses for dam safety. And today I'm going to be presenting on mixed populations in flood hazard analysis. In 1964, there was a major flood that caused widespread flooding in Montana. There were precip records broken, many stream flow peak records broken, all across the Rocky Mountains in Montana. One of our dams, Gibson Dam on the Sun River, was actually overtopped during this event. Floodwaters went right over the top of the dam, not how it was designed to, and they had to actually modify the dam afterwards. Now, one of the reasons this event was such a surprise and an outlier is that most floods in the region are the result of snowmelt, and this flood was the result instead of rain. And this is maybe similar to some floods you're more familiar with, like the Big Thompson in 1976 and the Boulder Canyon floods in 2013, basins that are historically snowmelt dominated. Each year, floods are the result of melting snow. And then in these other years, you have these late fall or early summer monsoon precip type events that end up blowing all of the other floods out of the water. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily mixed population analysis. Now, I'll start by talking a little bit more about flood hazard analysis in general. Then I'll move on to talking about mixed populations and what those are. And then I'll close with a case study on Gibson Dam in Montana. So what is a flood hazard analysis? In general, it's a study to estimate the size of rare floods for a site. And so, for example, here we have our little basin and our site of interest. And we've got stream flow data for the site. Maybe we have paleo flood data. Maybe we've got precip data and other types of meteorology and climate information on the snowpack that was present. And you take all of this information for your site, maybe even for your region, and you use it to conduct a flood hazard analysis, which allows you to then estimate flood frequency. You're probably most familiar with this in the 100-year flood or the 500-year flood, the 0.01 AEP, annual exceedance probability flood, right? We use these all the time in our FEMA risk maps, where we've got our 100-year and our 500-year floodplains defined. Those are based on the estimates of the flows that have that kind of recurrence or annual exceedance probability. And so a flood hazard analysis is really the study that allows us to estimate the magnitude of those floods. So the main guidance for conducting a flood hazard analysis is published in Bulletin 17C. This is a publication developed by multiple federal agencies. It outlines the data, methods, and techniques for flood risk analysis, and it includes recommendations for what distribution to use, how to fit that distribution to your data, how to incorporate all different types of data. And so this is really the standard for how to conduct a flood hazard analysis. We at the Bureau of Reclamation use this as our primary guide, along with some other manuals developed by our agency. So what is the assumption? What is the assumption underlying a flood hazard analysis? First, we assume that an annual maximum series, so the largest flood for each year, all of those put together, that they are reliable estimates, that they reliably have measured floods that have occurred. And if they don't, if there's high error in a measurement, maybe you don't use that data. Maybe we use an interval to represent the flood in a given year. And the second assumption is that they're representative sample of random and homogeneous events. And so what this means is that all of these floods, the maximum flood from each year of record, that is just a sample of floods from a bigger population of floods that could occur. And so we can represent them by a distribution. And so with these assumptions, we can take the floods in our AMS, or annual maximum series, and we can assign plotting positions to them. And so here's the equation from Bolton 17C. Essentially, you take each of the floods, you sort them, you rank them, and then based on their rank, divided by the total number of floods plus 1, you assign an annual exceedance probability to that flood. And so, for instance, if you had 100 years of floods, your largest flood would have a recurrence interval, an annual exceedance probability of about 1%. And so once you've done that, you then fit a distribution to the plotted data. Bolton 17C recommends using a log Pearson type 3 or LP3 distribution, and fitting using the expected moments algorithm, which is published in multiple places and documented in Bolton 17C. And so let's look at an example. Here we have some of the streamflow records for Gibson Dam in Montana. And what you see here is each of these blue bars is an observed flood. And then these two grayed areas are places where we have missing data, and we have to make an assumption about the size of the floods that occurred in those years. And so we use what's called a perception threshold. And so in this case, the assumption is that the floods that occurred in these years were smaller than the largest flood on record. Pretty conservative and standard type of estimate. Largest flood of record is the 1964 flood that we talked about beginning this presentation. And so once you have your data, you would take, again, all of these floods, you would sort them, rank them, and then apply plotting positions. Here they are plotted. One thing that's going to be a little different on this plot is here's our 1964 flood of record. Because there is perception threshold used for a few years, we actually have a larger gap here. It's not a perfect plotting position according to the equation. It gets a little bit more complicated as you add additional data or intervals or perception thresholds. And so here our data has been plotted. And once you've done that, you then would use an algorithm or program to fit data to these peaks. And so here's a fit distribution, log Pearson 3. And from this, we have our 100-year out here, right where the annual exceedance probability equals 1%, and that's about 34,000 CFS. So let's recall our assumptions though, right? An annual maximum series is reliable and represents a sample of random and homogeneous events. But what happens if the AMS isn't homogeneous? So in this case, showing an example of a probability distribution function, and you can see that it has two peaks. It's bimodal. It's a mixed population. It's actually representing two different populations. And so what do I mean by that? So Bolton 17C talks about how at some locations, you have multiple mechanisms. You've got multiple causes for floods. These can be snowmelt, rainstorms, combinations, hurricanes in parts of the country. When you have this, you have a mixed population. Your floods each year are produced by different mechanisms. And so where do we have mixed populations? This figure is taken from a report published by Kathleen Schleff in 2019. And so what we're showing here is a map of the US. And each of these different cells with the colored circle are different stream gauges across the US showing the different mechanisms that dominate the biggest flood at that location. And so you can kind of see a bunch of different types. You've got kind of along the West Coast, northern and southern PE, Pineapple Express. So you move into the Sierras and parts of the Rockies, you get this light green, which is snowmelt. And as you move, further over, you begin getting tropical storms and different other types of events. And so for the Rocky Mountains, snowmelt is the most frequent cause for floods most years and the largest floods at many sites. Now, while that's true, there are also many types of rain-driven. In fact, most floods are rain-driven. And so you can even see in our region that you have multiple different types of mechanisms. And so what you probably have in the basins that you work with as certified floodplain managers or working with stormwater are rivers that most years have snowmelt floods, but occasionally, like we've seen in Boulder, you have a rain flood that is much larger than the snowmelt floods. And so that would represent a mixed population. And so why should we actually separate them if they exist? Why not just fit your distribution to all of the data you have? So, one of the main reasons for that is that fitting a distribution to a mixed population can distort the data. So here we got a little example. Here's a bunch of our floods and distribution fit to it. Now, what if actually you had two different sets of data, two different mechanisms? And if you separated them and fit distributions to them individually, you end up getting a very different look at your flood frequency, right? This dashed blue line, these higher floods, they're much higher and they look very different, especially as you begin getting to more rare events than the original fit. And then this lower distribution, well, it kind of flattens out, doesn't really drive risk in this area. And so Fulton 17C recommends that you separate out mixed populations, that you handle them separately so that you can estimate the risk for the individual populations. Now, how do you identify if you have a mixed population? So one of the biggest reasons, if you're doing a study or if you just want to be guiding someone you've hired to do a study or just for your own interest, you probably want to start by understanding your basin. When do floods occur? What data can you look at? Do you have precip gauges or snow-tell gauges? Can you check what is happening and causing the largest flows in your basin? And that's really going to be the best way to tell if you have a mixed population. Do multiple things cause floods in your basin? Now, another way to tell is when you have your annual maximum series, if you look at their distribution in time or in magnitude, is it bimodal? Are there multiple times of the year or multiple flow values that are really very present? Because if that's the case, it's very possible that you're dealing with a mixed population where you have samples from two different mechanisms present. And then finally, another way to kind of tell if you have a mixed population is if your distribution fit looks kind of off. It's a little funky. Maybe it's positively skewed, kind of keeps increasing as you get to more rare flood events. And yeah, that can be just a suggestion that maybe the data you're using isn't actually a sample representing a single population, but is representing multiple populations. And so, in any case, if you think you have a mixed population, it's very good to look at the meteorological data to actually try to identify and understand what is causing the floods so you can credibly separate them. when mechanisms can be shown to have distinct seasons, it's sometimes possible that you could actually just separate out the events by time of year. For instance, if you have snowmelt floods, but then your other mechanism is late summer monsoon, there's a few months between those, and it's very possible that you could just identify the two populations depending on when they occur. Alternatively, if it can be shown that the two mechanisms have very different magnitudes, perhaps your snowmelt floods are very small and your thunderstorms are very big, then it may also be possible to separate out the mechanisms by magnitude and then fit a distribution to that data that's been separated. And so let's actually walk into an example. So this is Gibson Dam. I started out showing a picture of it overtopping in '64. And so this dam is up in Montana, located in the Rocky Mountains. There's a snow-tell site in this basin that I'm going to be using throughout the presentation. So it's located right here, just about 8 miles south of the dam. So here I've got some plots of annual precip, snow, and then inflow. In each case, these are box and whisker plots. So that dark black line is the median. This kind of gray or colored shaded area is the 25th to 75th. And then these whiskers at the end are 5th and 95th. So this gives you an idea of the values that are most common throughout the year. And so, first thing to notice is that precip mostly occurs during the fall and winter. There's a distinct snow accumulation. In the fall, you begin to have increasing snowpack. And then as you get towards April and spring, April, May, June, you have a very distinct snowmelt season as the snow water equivalent in the basin decreases. Now, your inflows to the dam, they peak in April and June. And so this is right during the period of maximum precip during the year, but also snowmelt. So we've got two different things acting at once. And so this to me suggests that we've got possibly have a mixed population where one or both of these mechanisms could be present and causing floods. And so this is also actually a conclusion that an earlier USGS study found. And so it seems pretty clear it's a mixed population. So how do we handle that? So because the floods are occurring during the same time of the year, I couldn't just separate them. And so I actually had to work on separating them by identifying the cause of each flood. And so here I'm showing precip on the top panel, and then temperature in that middle panel, and then at the bottom I've got daily inflows to the reservoir. So I used this data to try to identify the mechanism associated with each year's floods. And so I really only identified rain-dominated and melt-dominated. I didn't go into more detail. You have purely a melt event or purely a rain event, because both tend to be present during floods. And so which one is dominating the flood, causing the flood more? And this is simplification, right? When you're talking about a mixed population, well, a rain event without any snow is different than a rain event with snow, and that's different than just snow by itself. And you could continue to make distinctions until your mixed population is about 10 different populations. And so here we're simplifying it, just identifying 2. And so I used a script to use all of this data and try to actually identify the mechanism. And so here we've got snowmelt, temperature, daily flow. So how were they actually identified. So I created a Python script that, there's a few different questions. First, is snow water equivalent data available? If yes, then we go into this logical. If the 3-day melt is greater than 0, if the average temperature is greater than 40, then it's a melt event. If 3-day precip is greater than 0.25 inches, then rain is present. And in cases where both mechanisms are present, whichever mechanism had a greater depth, if you had 2 inches of melt but only 1 inch of rain, then it was a melt event. And if the snow data wasn't available, then instead I had to make the assumption just based on temperature and precip. And so for this study, I actually used the period when I had snow melt information available to train the model so that I could then project back in time to periods where we didn't have snow data. And so in this case, we're looking at a warmer temperature greater than 50 Fahrenheit. And we're looking at a smaller depth of precip. And this is because I'm using a different data set. And again, if both are identified, then there's a comparison to be made. How much the rain or the temperature exceed the threshold that's being used was the way that we separated out which one was dominated. Now, maximum flow was assigned for both mechanisms for each year. And then I manually inspected each year. So we're not just letting the model select all of this. And so what does this actually look like? So here's an example. For this year, we've got our depth of precip and melt in the top panel. Then we've got our temperature data through the middle, and then we've got our actual flow data in the bottom. And so mechanisms were identified for all the daily flow maxima. So you can see down here, these bars, each time there was a peak, a mechanism was assigned. And then the maximum flow for both mechanisms were identified. So for rain, what was the greatest rain peak? And for melt, what was the greatest melt peak? And so this was done for each year so that we could create 2 time series, 2 annual maximum series of floods for melt and rain type events. And so here we got a figure of our melt with its perception thresholds and the actual melt floods. And then overlaid over that, we've got our rain perception thresholds and rain floods. And so these 2 distinct samples were then used in a flood hazard analysis. Distributions were fit, and that's what we have here. We've got a comparison of the different model fits. And so at the top, we've got our rain curve, which is much higher than the other curves for rare events. And then we have our snow curve, which really flattens out as you get to more rare annual exceedance probabilities. And then this black line is that original curve I showed earlier that is just taking the annual maximum series as is without trying to separate out by mechanism. Now, right here, we've got our 100-year. It's about 35,000 from the rain curve. And like I said earlier, it's about 34,000 from the mixed population curve. It's not a very big difference. Now, it wasn't a big difference in this case, but that's not always how it's going to work. In some basins, there will be very distinct differences between the 2 curves. In this case, we were somewhat lucky to have a small change in the estimate for the 100-year and more rare floods. But it's when possible, it's important to actually analyze the different mechanisms, because if they aren't separated, you can't be certain that the actual frequency and magnitude of floods looks like your mixed population curve. You could be over or underestimating rare floods. And this has greater implications as you move to rarer floods for the 500-year or 1,000-year. And so today I talked a bit about flood hazard analysis, both in 17C, talked about the idea of mixed populations, conceptually and practically how to identify them. And then I've just discussed a case study for Gibson Dam in Montana. These are my references, and yeah, if you got any questions, I'll take them now.